Welcome to another program in our series, Freethinking Forum. It's my delight today to have with me the author of this book, The War on Science. Who's waging it, why it matters, what we can do about it. Shawn Otto, welcome to our program.
For having me.
You have written a magnificent book. I've seen a quote from Walter Mondale, our former vice president. Evidence from science is one of the world's great equalizers because it forms an objective basis for public policy. This book illustrates how central that notion is to the forming of modern democracy, and how current attacks on science endanger our freedom. Policymakers and voters everywhere would do well to read this book, The War on Science. That's high praise.
Thank you. Yes, I very much appreciated that praise.
And I've just learned that the people reviewing your book on Amazon have all given it 5 stars, the maximum.
So far.
So far. There'll probably be some science deniers registering it as 1, but you helped us know who are the science deniers and some of their motives, their connivances.
Yes.
So, you want to tell us about what you've done so far since the book is published? I heard you at the Loft Literary Society and
Sure.
To a packed house.
Yeah, that was a program that Don Shelby and I did.
And that's up on YouTube now, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yep. The Uptake, I think, was there, and they filmed that one, so that can be found on YouTube. And I've been traveling, doing other talks like that in other cities, as well as in Washington, D.C., trying to get voters and policymakers really to focus on how science is a fundamental force for justice and civil rights in the United States, because it ensures that public policy is based on evidence, not on some vested interests or vested ideology.
That's so important.
Absolutely.
And I don't know that has there been another nation in the world that has done this yet? Does Canada or UK or
that is working on
trying to base their public policy on science?
Well, that was really the kind of the foundation of democracy. Thomas Jefferson really drew on the early ideas of science from what he called his trinity of 3 greatest men: Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, and John Locke. And the
3
idea,
great men,
yes, they were. And Jefferson, you may know, was not just a lawyer, but also a scientist.
Yeah.
Like Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was the Attorney General of England, but he was also a scientist and kind of the creator of much of what we think of as today's scientific method. But the idea that Jefferson drew on to convince all the other Enlightenment nations not to intervene in the Revolutionary War was that if anyone can discover the truth of something for him or herself using the tools of science and reason, then no pope, no monarch, and no wealthy lord had any greater right to rule than the people did themselves. And that idea of reason and evidence really informed the formation of the United States.
So it was, in a sense, the scientific approach to public policy was begun with
Absolutely.
Jefferson and others here.
That's right, yes. In fact, these questions that science grapples with are always complex and confusing. We think of science the way that we learn it in school, where you're kind of regurgitating to get the right answer often, but that's not the way science really works.
That's not the essence of science.
No, it's pondering and feeling and pawing into the darkness where we don't have knowledge about something, about the way nature works, and trying to create that knowledge based on experiments. And sometimes those ideas are confusing, and Thomas Jefferson himself became confused when he was drafting the Declaration of Independence. If you read the first draft, it's really interesting. He said, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights.
Self-evident.
Yes, and Benjamin Franklin, the leading scientist in the United States at that time, Jefferson gave him that draft, and Franklin took a pen and he put several backslashes through sacred and undeniable and wrote in the word self-evident, because the idea is that if you make an appeal to the divine, you're essentially creating a theocratic argument for the country, and anyone who has a different religion then can argue with that. But if you make an appeal to reason and say that it's self-evident, which was a phrase that Franklin borrowed from David Hume, then you are appealing to a very narrow claim that is very difficult to argue with, because it's based on our process of building knowledge using science.
Yeah, just look for yourself. You'll see that it's true.
Yes, that's right.
We don't have to have someone else tell us it's true.
In fact, yes, that was one of John Locke's tests of what is something of knowledge. He had 3 different tests, he said. Knowledge was either intuitive, in which case you can look and see that there are 2 cups on this table, so I can say 1, 2, there are 2 cups. That's something that we can just look and we can see for ourselves. It's intuitively true. Then we could say, I can take this cup and this piece of paper and I can drop, I'm not going to really drop them, but I could drop them and they would fall to the floor at different rates.
Yeah.
But if I put them both in a vacuum tube and suck out all the air and drop them, they'll fall at the same rate.
Yes.
So then we can conclude that air has an effect on the way that gravity works. And that's called demonstrative knowledge, where you demonstrate using an experiment of some sort that what you're saying is true. And finally, the last test of the 3 that John Locke defined for knowledge was sensitive knowledge, where we can smell a rose, but it might not be a rose. It might be a rose, but it might also be perfume. So he made the point that our common sense is the least reliable form of knowledge. And then after that, John Locke said, anything else is but faith or opinion, but not knowledge, at least in the way that we define knowledge.
Mm-hmm. So I can see why Don Shelby, our Peabody Award-winning news anchor, is calling this one of the most important books published in the last decade.
Well, that's high praise too, and I really appreciate that. Don is very concerned, as I'm sure you are, because I've talked to you about this, about the rise of problems in the media and in journalism.
Oh, yes.
Around what is real and what is just an argument. And that's a lot of what the war on science tackles. It goes back to these kind of foundation arguments that you and I have been talking about here. And then it says, if this is the basis for democracy, and we base public policy decisions on evidence, how come we're getting into all these problems where, for instance, all the scientists have created all this evidence over half a century using billions of data points now, some of them sacrificing their lives to create this, to show that, in fact, the evidence shows that humans are causing global warming. And yet our public policy process is frozen on this, and politicians are denying the science. That's not the way that Jefferson imagined that it would work.
He didn't realize that corporations would have a very strong interest in denying.
Yes, they do, and they're one of the vested interests. There are 3 battlefronts in the war on science. One is the industrial war on science that you just described, where a company has a vested interest that they want to protect, so they have an economic reason to mount a public relations campaign to create uncertainty in the minds of the public around the science. And to circle back to Don Shelby, one of the things that he was concerned about was the rise of something called false balance in the media, where I'm sure you've seen it.
Yeah. On the other hand,
right.
They don't recognize them as science deniers.
Yes, and that's the problem, is that you have one half of the screen if it's a TV screen, or one half of the news story if it's a newspaper, describing what a spokesperson is saying, a scientist is saying, based on all these experiments that these thousands of scientists have done. This is the information the public should know. And then on the other half of the screen, you have somebody that's very charismatic that is seeking to convince you that their opinion is right. but they don't have the evidence on their side. And media, journalists, often treat these as two equal perspectives.
They're
And that's
not.
called false balance, because
Yeah.
one doesn't have the evidence.
Yes.
So it skews our whole public policy making process towards the extreme views by giving them an unearned platform.
Yes. Now, I particularly like Chapter 12, battle plans.
Yes,
14 battle points of battle.
that's right.
And we may not get to them all, but you've already been pushing for science debates, asking the politicians to show that they have a basic understanding of the science that informs the public policy that they'll be voting on or
right.
implementing. We need to expect them to have science advisors. And before the election, we need to post their answers online.
That's right. That's something that we started doing, me and a couple of associates and friends of mine, including Lawrence Krauss, who was kind enough to write a foreword, to the book for me, as well as Matthew Chapman, who is Charles Darwin's great-great-grandson, and some other science writers, scientists, and a philosopher. 6 of us, all told, got together and created this organization called sciencedebate.org in late 2007, because we saw at that point in time that candidates for public office, particularly for president, really weren't talking about any of the big science issues facing the country.
And the media were not asking the question.
That's right, they weren't. And that's still a problem. I'll give you one example from 2007/8 and now, all right? So going back to this climate change thing, we noticed in January of 2008 that at that point in time, the 5 top TV news anchors had asked the candidates a total of 2,975 questions in 171 different interviews. How many do you suppose even mention the word global warming or climate change? 6 out of nearly 3,000. And it doesn't matter which side of the issue you're on, it's the largest economic/environmental issue probably the president's going to face.
And only 6 questions out of those thousands.
Now, and put that in perspective, they asked 3 questions about UFOs. So that's the relative importance that the National Press Corps gave to that issue in 2008. So let's flash forward 8 years now. President Obama has worked on this clean power plan. We had this attempt at a cap and trade system in 2009 and 2010 in Congress that didn't wind up going anywhere. And there's been a lot more talk about this in the media. And late last year, in November and December of last year, was the Paris Climate Summit, where for the first time, 195 countries came together and forged an agreement to begin transitioning the global economy off of carbon, right? In the week after that historic agreement, there was a Republican debate for president and a Democrat debate for president. How many questions do you think they asked in the Republican debate about climate change?
Well, it should have been 3 or 4.
Yeah, it was 0.
0.
How many do you suppose they asked in the Democratic debate?
Surely 1 or 2.
0.
Why?
So the press is checked out when it comes to actually engaging on politically contentious issues that have a big input from science. And it's a serious problem in our democracy.
Now, one of your battle plans, number 12, editors should insist on pro-evidence journalism, and investigative journalists should target the fraud of science denial. That's so important.
It is, absolutely. Well, there was a case that some people may have heard recently. It's come to light, and I talk about this in the book, actually, about how members of the member corporations of the American Petroleum Institute knew since 1968, at least, that burning fossil fuels was going to raise the temperature significantly by the year 2000. Their scientists were telling them back then. And Exxon in particular knew very well in the 1970s and 80s that this was a big problem. And yet they mounted a large investment in climate denial, funding all sorts of climate denial groups. And the issue legally is whether this is fraud on the taxpayer or shareholders of Exxon, if they
Or
were
both.
hiding risks to
Yeah.
their market performance.
Yes.
Yeah. So the idea is that in a democracy, if somebody is arguing against the evidence, they probably have an interest that isn't supported by the evidence, and that's why they're doing that. But we have to base public policy decisions, like it or not, by letting the chips fall where they may, and then figuring out the best public policy based on what the evidence says.
Well, I don't like that analogy of chips falling where they may.
Well,
I mean,
the chips
we,
of the
we,
evidence.
We got to look
let's
at,
say it that way.
okay, so long as we're talking about scientific evidence.
Yes.
Because not everyone is lying because of some corporate interest, but we
No,
have to discern
absolutely.
which ones are based on science.
Right, and there are so many ways that we all confuse ourselves in daily life, because there are things that we wish were true. Francis Bacon said 400 years ago that what a man had rather were true, he more readily believes.
Yes.
And this is something that we face in democracy all the time. So it's not always the ill-meaning or nefarious corporation or something like that. It's a complex process, but it's so important that we find out what the evidence says, because we're living in a time when science is impacting more and more and more of life everywhere on the planet.
Now, in part 3 of your book, one chapter on the industrial war on science, we talked about that, but what's the ideological war on science?
Well,
Is that from
that's generally driven by fundamentalists who
religion?
Yes, who object to science's growing body of knowledge about the human reproductive cycle, human
Yeah.
reproductive process, or what science says about origins of the universe. They view that as God's territory, and that science doesn't have any business talking about that, and that we don't have any business basing public policy on it. For instance, public policy about abortion or the morning after pill. A lot of these things, like the morning after pill, get into the definition of when life begins. And if when sperm and egg meet, is that a life, or is a
No.
woman not really pregnant until actually that fertilized egg implants in the uterine lining, which is the scientific and currently legal definition of when pregnancy begins.
Yeah.
So those kinds of debates have to happen often as we refine our knowledge. We have to refine our morals and ethics and our legal code to go along with that new knowledge. So science is always kind of a creatively disruptive process that way, that's challenging us morally and ethically. So that's the ideological war, is people who can't adjust or don't want to adjust to that new knowledge and push back against it.
Is there another one, the identity politics war?
Yes, and that comes more from people on the left, particularly out of a field of humanities that started as literary criticism or theory called postmodernism. And that was the idea that evolved sort of right after World War II, that science was just one of many ways of knowing, and it didn't have any greater claim on the truth than, say, indigenous knowledge or African American knowledge or female knowledge. And this type of thinking was attractive because it aligned with a lot of what was going on in the civil rights movement at the time. But it mistakenly portrayed science as just another way of knowing that had no greater claim to the truth than any of the identity politics ways of knowing. But that's actually the opposite of what science is all about.
Yes.
Science says that I am going to create an experiment, it's what nature tells me, and I'm going to pull out a little bit of knowledge that is true no matter who does the measuring, whether they're female, male, what gender they are, what religion they are, what race they are, what nationality they are, what any of their belief systems tell them. It will be true no matter who does the measuring. And that's the beauty and the power of what we've developed with science, and why it's so important for public policy.
So science is not just one point of view among others.
That's right.
The way the postmodernists have characterized it.
Yes, and that's where we get into trouble with our public policy, because if science is just regarded as one of many opinions, well, that argument can go on forever, and you see that in the talking heads in our news every day.
Yeah. Now, on your battle plans, number one is do something.
Yes.
I read more, take a public stand against the war on science and organize, see a need, seek out others, and do something to change the world.
Yes, well, that really came from my own personal experience there, being one of those 6 people who founded this organization, sciencedebate.org, that posted this call for people, for politicians, particularly the candidates for president, to debate these big things. And it went viral. And within weeks, we had 40,000 scientists and engineers that signed on. And ultimately, President Obama, when he was sworn in, quoted our mission statement in his inaugural address, and he appointed several of our early supporters to his cabinet, making him, it really changing his perspective on science and making his presidency one of the more science-friendly presidencies. So individuals taking action, joining with others, really can change the course of history. And then, in fact, that's the only way history has ever been changed. But the other thing is that you don't have to take dramatic effort that is a large commitment like that. It's also just important to engage in groups, or, for instance, to just write a letter to the editor or contact the ombudsman of a television show if you see them engaging in false balance, for instance, and put pressure back on them, saying, it doesn't matter what your political perspective is, I don't want you guys portraying evidence with the same weight that somebody's opinion has.
Yes. Well done. Now, you've included in the book a science pledge, and I'm sure you've signed it, and many others of your scientist friends have signed it. But I like the way you set it up here, where I hereby pledge that public decisions must be based on evidence, number one. Knowledge must not be suppressed. Scientific integrity must be protected. Freedom of inquiry must be encouraged. And major science issues must be openly debated.
That's right.
And you give some explanation of each of those here in the Science Pledge, above where there's space for the candidate's signature and the office sought or held.
Yes, and that's what I'm seeking to do there is to cause discussion about all the pledges that we see candidates take. Usually pledges seek to constrict them or bind them. For instance, the No New Taxes pledge, saying I will oppose any effort at increasing taxes. This seeks to open the debate by saying I'm going to stand with evidence, and these are the fundamental values of the United States that I'm going to back up when I am in office.
I really like that. I hope we can move along on that particular battle plan.
Yes, I do
get
too.
that one moving to more people, not just the presidential candidates.
It's a big problem not only in the United States, I should say. It's happening in various places around the world. Even this Brexit campaign where Britain voted to leave the European Union. There was the lead campaigner, Boris Johnson there, a journalist and former mayor of London, was broadly accused of really campaigning with disinformation for that. And another member of parliament that was backing it said, you know, members of the UK are tired of experts. We don't want to hear from experts.
Tired of experts?
Yeah.
That's what our civilization is built on.
Well, it's an example of the same kind of thing and the same kind of thinking. There are people who we rely on to spend their lives studying something so that they can find out the facts about it so that we can make better public policy decisions in democracy. You want experts. You don't want to disregard them.
Well, just as I try to comply with my doctor's advice, he's a medical scientist.
Yes.
And backed by many other medical scientists that each have their specialty coming together to advise me on how to maintain my health.
That's right. You may not always like what they have to say, but you know that you're better off if you actually listen to it.
Yeah. Well, and I think you found a survey too, maybe even sponsored the survey, that found that that the voters want to support candidates who support science.
They do, actually. This organization that I co-founded, sciencedebate.org, we teamed up with another organization called Research America, and we commissioned Harris Polling to do an independent, double-blind from us, national poll asking the candidates asking voters their opinions about this. And 85% of voters, almost 86, Democrat and Republican alike, within a tenth of a percentage point of one another, agreed that they thought that the candidates ought to be talking about the big science, tech, health, and environmental issues facing the nation, and that these things have as much impact on voters' lives as do the foreign policy and economic policy that candidates often talk about.
Yeah. Now, Bill Nye, the science guy, has great praise for you, Shawn. Shawn Otto makes a case that can't be refuted. So science is important to all of us, especially in a democracy. He backs it up with peer-reviewed studies, carefully researched numbers, and his own extensive experience. He uses the process of science to prove that we need science in order to remain free. Here's hoping voters everywhere take him seriously soon. I would say now.
Yeah. Next time I talk to him, I'll tell him you suggested edit.
So we've got less than 3 minutes left. What are some of the things that you've learned as you've discussed this with others who responded
Oh
to
my
questions?
goodness, you know, people, regardless of political party, agree that we may not agree on what the best policy solutions are always, but we in America do value basing public policy on evidence. Even if it's not evidence that we want to hear, we realize that that's the foundation of our legal system, it's the foundation of our justice system, and it's the foundation of democracy itself. So one thing that people can do, I tell them, is to go to sciencedebate.org and sign on there. You can sign on to that call, that petition, to get the candidates for president and other public offices to debate the big science, tech, health, and environmental issues facing the country.
Even our state representatives?
Oh yes, we think that this is something that should be happening at every level, that public officials really have an obligation to let the public know where they stand on these issues, because they do impact so much of life these days.
Well, good. Well, Shawn, this has been a powerful venture here in exploring your wonderful new book, The War on Science. It builds on another book that you wrote a while back.
That's right.
Don't
Fool Me Twice, that was called. Yes.
Fool Me Twice, yes.
This is the second installment in that exploration.
And you built so beautifully on this. Bill McKibben of 350.org, we're seeing right now a titanic battle between the power of science and the power of money, and money is winning. This book explains why and offers some pointers that might get us back on the right track. So, Shawn, thanks for getting us back on the right track.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for tuning in. I hope you can make use of this excellent book in your own lives.
I do too.